Evan sat alone near the flickering power core heater in his mountain shelter, built on the edge of the northern ridge of a frozen alien world where the cold seemed endless and the silence outside was deeper than space itself, with snow falling slowly through the glass window and thick clouds rolling over the high peaks above his lonely outpost. He had long grown used to the isolation, working as a maintenance tech for the tower high above civilian zones. The job was simple: survive, report, maintain the signal, and wait for the supply drones that came once a month. Nothing ever changed here. The days passed without much meaning until that night when everything shifted with a sound he had never expected to hear in such a place. It was soft at first, like the scraping of fabric against the snow, or maybe just the wind curling around the shelter's corners. But then it came again. A dragging sound, a thump like something or someone falling near the front hatch, and Evan froze in place, his hand tightening on the thermal mug he had just raised to his lips. He lowered it slowly and stood up, his boots making soft sounds against the metal floor. He moved to the hatch without turning on the outer lights because the storm had mostly passed and the moonlight gave just enough visibility through the fogged window. He pressed the manual override and opened the door slowly, expecting to find maybe a fallen crate or some broken equipment from the last drone drop, but instead he saw her, a shape barely visible against the snow, a body half buried, a figure small and still not moving. And only when he stepped outside did he realize it was a woman. No, a girl, maybe an alien girl, but clearly humanoid, her skin a dull bluish shade, her arms wrapped around herself, her body trembling so faintly it was barely noticeable, her eyes half open but unfocused, as if she was barely aware of her surroundings. Evan hesitated because this wasn't supposed to happen. People didn't just appear here, especially not aliens, especially not ones dressed in nothing but tattered cloth and a cracked metal collar glowing faintly around her neck. He looked around, but there was no one else, no ship, no vehicle, no tracks leading away, just her and the snow and the cold that could kill within minutes. He cursed under his breath, but not in anger, more in disbelief, then stepped forward and crouched beside her. His hand touched her shoulder, and it was like ice. Her body was shutting down from exposure, and if he left her there, she would not last the hour. He could still walk away, close the hatch, go back inside, and pretend he never saw her. It would be the safe choice, the legal one, the rational one, because the collar meant she had been a slave, and helping a discarded slave was against protocol. Aiding her could cost him his job, maybe even his freedom. But as he looked down at her, as her lips moved slightly, as if she was trying to form words, he knew there was only one thing he could do. He lifted her in his arms, surprised by how light she was, and carried her into the shelter, kicking the door closed behind him. The heater hissed softly as he placed her near the warmth, then pulled blankets and the emergency thermal wrap from the storage locker. He wrapped her carefully, working quickly, trying not to think about the laws he was breaking or the questions that might come later. She didn't resist, she just breathed weakly, barely hanging on, and her eyes blinked slowly, as if registering him for the first time. She looked afraid, not of the cold, but of him, and he realized she had likely never known kindness from a human, or maybe from anyone. He reached for the water canister and gently pressed the straw to her lips. She drank slowly, cautiously, then coughed and whispered something he couldn't understand. He asked her name, but she just shook her head, or maybe she didn't know what he was saying. Maybe she had no name. Hours passed as he monitored her temperature, adjusted the heater levels, and tried to keep her comfortable. Every so often, she opened her eyes, looked around, then drifted back into a strange half-sleep, as if unsure whether this was real or another cruel dream. Evan sat nearby, not speaking, just watching, listening to the storm outside, wondering who had left her here, and why they had chosen his shelter out of all the places on this frozen rock. He thought about calling it in, sending a report to Central Command, but even as the thought crossed his mind, he rejected it because he already knew how they would respond. They would take her away, put her back in chains, or worse, they wouldn't see her as a person, just as discarded property. And that idea made something twist in his chest. When morning came, she was still asleep, but her breathing was steady now, her face less pale, her fingers no longer stiff from the cold. Evan moved around the shelter preparing food, warming another blanket, and as he looked at her again, he wondered what story she carried, what pain she had endured, and why the universe could be so cruel to someone so silent and broken. She stirred once more, opened her eyes, and whispered a word he didn't understand, but this time she reached weakly for his hand and held it as if she was afraid he would vanish like everyone else in her life had done before. And Evan sat there in silence, letting her hold on, because right now he was the only warmth she had, and whatever came next he wasn't going to turn away. Not now, not ever. The mountains outside remained covered in ice. The wind still howled across the ridges and the cold still ruled the land. But inside that small shelter, something had changed. Something human, something real, and in that frozen silence a fragile connection had begun to form, one that neither law nor fear could easily break. The shelter was quiet, except for the soft hum of the power core and the low rhythm of the storm easing away beyond the thick walls of metal and ice. Evan moved carefully around the small space, checking monitors, adjusting pressure valves, watching over the girl who now lay under a thick layer of thermal blankets. Her breathing steady, her skin no longer gray, but still weak, as if her body was unsure whether it could trust warmth again. She had not spoken much since he found her, only a few words in broken speech, and yet something in her eyes said more than language could hold, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a strange kind of disbelief. As if this was the first time anyone had offered her safety without demand, Evan brought a small bowl of warm broth and sat beside her, gently lifting her head and helping her sip. She hesitated at first, eyes locked on his face, searching for trick or threat, but she drank slowly, little by little, and when he smiled she didn't return it, but she didn't look away either. That small moment of stillness between them was fragile and uncertain, but real, and Evan knew the weight of it without needing words, because trust was never easy to give when life had only taught you pain. He asked her name again in soft tone, but she only blinked and whispered something close to Lena, and he repeated it softly, and she didn't correct him, so he called her that from then on, Lena, and the name settled in the air like a breath of something new, something not owned or branded, but hers alone. She tried to sit on her own later that day, struggling with weak arms and trembling muscles, and Evan moved to help but paused, waiting for her signal, and when she nodded once he supported her, slowly guiding her to lean against the wall near the heater. Her eyes wandered over the space, noting the tools, the old radio, the worn-out maps, and the single photo frame on the shelf, showing a much younger Evan with two other people, perhaps family, though the colors had faded long ago. Lena touched her collar lightly, the cracked device still faintly glowing with old code. She spoke slowly, her voice like dry paper, saying she had been taken young from a world whose name she no longer remembered, used, sold, traded. Her body marked as product, her voice silenced by command chips and punishments when she failed to serve. Without question she said they had deemed her broken, that her mind was no longer useful and her presence unwanted, and so they threw her out like waste near a human zone, assuming either the weather or the wilds would finish what they started. Evan listened without interrupting, his chest tightening with every word. Her story not uncommon in the outer colonies, where the law turned away and slavery wore new names under corporate flags, but hearing it spoken like this in such a quiet voice, with such emptiness behind each word, made the reality sink deeper than before, and he felt anger rise inside him, not the loud kind, but the slow burning type that starts in the bones and never fades. He told her he would remove the collar, but she shook her head, not in refusal, but in fear, because tampering with such tech could trigger pain protocols, or worse, even death signals, and she had known others who had tried only to vanish in screams. Evan promised her that he would find a safe way to deactivate it, but only when she was stronger, only when the risk was low, and she nodded slowly, accepting the plan, not because she trusted it fully, but because for the first time, someone offered a future beyond chains. The days that followed moved in small, quiet steps. Lena gained strength bite by bite, Breath by breath by breath, she learned to walk again inside the small shelter, moving from one side to the other, leaning on the walls, and Evan never rushed her, never asked for more than she could give. He taught her words in his language, showing her the names of things: heater, blanket, spoon, sky. And she repeated them with effort, smiling once in a while when she got them right. Her smile faint like the flicker of dawn after a long night, but it stayed in his mind long after. They began to speak more, and she told him that her people had once fought against humans in the early wars of expansion, long before she was born, and that history had become a cage for those like her, born after the guns went silent, but still punished. For the past, Evan told her not all humans were the same, and she looked at him, then really looked, and said softly, "Not all, but most," and he could not argue with that truth. One evening, the monitor beeped quietly, alerting that a supply drone was on its way, due to arrive by the next cycle, bringing food, batteries, and medical kits. And Evan felt a new fear settle in his chest, because the drone carried cameras, data logs, and reports, and if anyone saw Lena inside his shelter, if anyone recognized the collar or her face, his life would not just change, it would likely end in chains or worse. He sat with her by the heater and explained the danger, and she listened, quietly, eyes calm, but voice firm, saying she would not let him suffer for helping her, that she would hide outside until the drone left. But Evan refused. He told her she had suffered enough, and he would not let the cold touch her again, no matter what came. He thought about hiding her in the crawl space under the floor, the emergency storage chamber, small, dark, but shielded from scanners, and Lena agreed only if he promised it would not be for long. The next morning, Evan prepared the space, lining it with warm cloths, giving her water and food, telling her exactly how long it would take, and when she could come out again. He handed her a small light and looked at her one last time before sealing the hatch, and as the drone approached, breaking the clouds with its silent flight, Evan stood alone outside, watching it descend, wondering how his simple, quiet life had changed so deeply in so few days, and knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Drone came in low from the northern sky, a silver shape sliding through thin clouds like a quiet shadow, and Evan stood still. As the wind pushed against him, sharp and dry, carrying the dust of old ice, the metal beast hovered for a moment, then landed near the cum relay, sending out a soft chime to announce arrival and begin its routine scan. Evan kept his breath slow, his face calm, his body steady, while inside him every thought raced fast and loud, because beneath his floor a living soul waited in silence, afraid to be found, afraid to be lost again. The hatch of the drone opened with a hiss, releasing cold mist and revealing a supply pod and a mechanical survey lens that blinked once, then turned blue, scanning the area. Evan greeted it as usual, offering his ID badge, holding it steady in front of the lens, while the system confirmed his status as active technician assigned to Mountain Outpost, 12 clearance level, low but clean, nothing illegal, nothing strange, just another quiet man surviving in the frosted. Asked him about his last report. He told it the truth: power stable, signal strong, no damage. No complaints, just the cold and silence as always, and the drone believed him. Because machines do not ask questions unless programmed to, and this one had no reason to doubt his voice or his eyes. Not unless someone somewhere had flagged his location, or marked his name, or guessed that something beneath his floor had changed the rules after the scan ended and the supplies were delivered. Evan signed the manifest and watched the drone rise again, lifting into the sky with its long metal arms folding away like wings of some ancient bird of steel, and he stood there until it was gone, truly gone, swallowed by clouds and distance, before he moved back inside, locking the door behind him, his hands cold, his heart heavy, his mind already reaching down to the crawl space below. He opened the hatch gently and found her there, Lena, curled up with the blanket wrapped tight around her face, half hidden by the shadows, her eyes wide as they adjusted to light again. And when she saw him, she whispered not a word of fear, but simply asked if it was safe now, and he nodded, lifting her out, slowly holding her weight with care, as if she were made of something fragile, not because she was weak, but because he knew how much had been broken before she came. To him for the rest of the day she said little, and he did not press her instead. He cooked a simple meal and shared it with her in silence, sitting across the small table while the heater hummed between them and the snow began again outside soft and slow, falling like ash from a sky that never truly rested. Later, when they sat near the fire, she looked at him and asked why he did it, why he chose to help when he could have walked away, when it would have been safer, smarter, easier, and he had no perfect answer, only that something in him refused to look at pain and say it was not his problem. She listened and nodded. After a long pause, she began to speak more than before, not rushed, not panicked, but slow, like someone walking out of fog and finding the path for the first time. She told him about the place she came from, a colony world now lost to war, how her people were once proud and fierce, how the stars had promised freedom, but gave only cages. Her mother had died in a factory, her brother taken by soldiers, and she had been sold before she could understand what selling meant. Her life had been spent in boxes and cells and ships, where names were replaced with numbers and voices were trained to obey. She had learned not to hope, not to dream, not to resist, because every time she did, pain followed, not always from fists, but from silence, from hunger, from the look in someone's eyes when they saw her as nothing more than a tool, a body, a thing to be used and discarded. And Evan listened, not with pity, but with something stronger, something that saw her not as victim, but as survivor, someone who had walked through fire and still breathed, still stood, still chose to speak as night returned and darkness wrapped around the shelter. She asked him a question that stayed in the air, like smoke. What is freedom? And Evan looked into the flames for a long time before answering, not a speech, not a lesson, just a quiet truth, that freedom is not a place or a paper. It is the right to choose your own steps, even if the path is hard, even if no one else understands. And she looked at him then, with eyes that carried old pain and new wonder, and said that if this was freedom, then maybe for the first time she wanted to live. But peace did not last long, not in a world shaped by rules written, far from the snow-covered silence of their shelter. 2 days later, while Evan checked the signal strength, a message came through, not from the drone, but from a patrol ship, a nearby enforcement unit, requesting permission to land for inspection, claiming routine checks. But Evan knew better. No one came here without reason. No one cared about routine unless something had triggered their interest. Maybe the drone had noticed something, maybe a scan caught a trace of extra heat, maybe someone somewhere had spoken too loud about a lost slave girl. And now the storm outside was not just made of wind and snow. He told Lena quickly, and she understood before he even finished. She helped gather her things, what little she had, and returned to the crawl space without complaint, only trust and fear. And Evan sealed it again, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from knowing that the next few hours could change everything. The ship arrived, not like the drone, but louder, heavier, armed, a clear threat, masked as protocol, and from it stepped 2 officers, not dressed for warmth, but for power. Their eyes sharp, their faces unreadable. They questioned him about power levels, about signal reports, about why his last logs were incomplete, even though they were not. And he answered calmly, never once flinching, never once looking toward the floor. They walked around, scanning each room, opening cabinets, measuring air composition, checking heat traces, and when one of them paused near the floor panel, Evan held his breath, but the officer turned away, commenting only that the place seemed more crowded than expected. Evan shrugged, said it must be the extra battery pack he installed. And the officer said nothing more. When they left, they gave him a warning, not a threat, but a reminder that helping fugitives was treason, and treason carried weight beyond numbers or names. And Evan smiled, the kind of smile that hides fire, and said he understood. And after the ship was gone, and the wind returned, and the stars blinked like old memories, he opened the hatch and pulled Lena out, holding her for a moment, longer than before, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said, not yet. Not while they still had time to make a new choice. The days passed with heavy silence wrapped in cold, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting for something to change. But inside the shelter, life had begun to move in quiet rhythms. Lena no longer looked over her shoulder. With every step, no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps. Her strength returned slowly, her hands steadier, her voice clearer, though her words still carried the weight of old chains. Evan taught her more each day, pointing to objects around the shelter, saying their names, repeating them, until she could speak with less fear and more trust, not just in him but in herself. She began to understand the machines, how they worked, what they meant, and even asked if she could help with the maintenance tasks. Evan agreed, not because he needed help, but because she needed purpose, something to do, something to build, other than walls inside her mind. They spent hours checking cables, adjusting heat flow, fixing broken tools, and she learned fast, her fingers precise, her focus sharp, like someone who had never been given a chance to learn before, and now clung to every moment as if it were breath. Outside, the weather grew harsher, the sky turning darker than before, with wind that cut through stone and snow that fell without end. But the shelter held strong, its power core steady, its walls unshaken, and while they lived in that small space, like two souls who had found something rare in the middle of nowhere, something quiet and unnamed, but real. But peace is a thing the world rarely allows to last long, and Evan knew that too well. The patrol ship's visit had left a shadow behind, a doubt growing stronger each time he checked the scanners and saw unusual signals in the area, strange static bursts, odd satellite shifts, things that should not be there. He did not tell Lena at first, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he was trying to find hope where none existed. He told himself it was nothing, that maybe the storm was disrupting the readings, but deep down, he knew better. Something was coming. Then came the knock, not a loud bang, not the cold hammer of metal fists, but a slow, heavy knock, 3 times against the outer hatch, not from a drone, not from a machine, but from a human hand. Evan stood frozen near the panel, staring at the door, as if it were no longer a door, but a judgment waiting to pass. He motioned to Lena to move to the crawl space, but before she could even take a step, a voice came through the speaker, polite, firm, official, asking for permission to enter, citing new inspection orders, claiming recent data inconsistencies and possible equipment faults. Seven replied with calm tone, asking for identification, and the voice gave it a name he did not recognize, but rank high enough to demand entry, and he knew then that refusal would only bring worse. The shelter was too small to hide much, and he had only seconds to act. He whispered to Lena to go down fast, to stay quiet, to not move, not even if she heard noise. She looked at him with eyes wide, not with fear, but with something deeper, the fear of losing what little she had found, and he touched her hand just once, before helping her slip below and sealing the hatch. He took a breath and opened the door. 2 officers entered, both wearing dark uniforms with white badges and steel eyes. Their boots tracked snow across the floor, and their eyes scanned every inch of the space, not with curiosity, but with purpose. One of them spoke with the same polite tone, asking about equipment status, signal strength, energy consumption. Logs were requested. Scans began. Evan gave answers, measured, careful, each one wrapped in layers of truth and lie mixed so finely no machine could pull them apart. They moved through the shelter, slowly checking vents, testing panels. One of them paused near the heater and asked about the recent power spike. Evan said it was a temporary overload from the storm surge, and offered to show the log. The officer nodded, but his eyes stayed cold, not trusting, not yet. Then they noticed the floor panel. One of them tapped his boot against it and asked what was stored below. Evan replied that it was emergency rations and repair parts, things standard for isolated stations, nothing out of place, nothing dangerous. The officer crouched down, scanned the panel, ran a reading, and looked up, saying the heat signature was slightly higher than expected. Evan smiled, said the heater vent passed close to that spot, and it always caused minor temperature bleed during high operation. The officer stared at him for a long second, then stood without a word. They asked more questions, none of them direct, but all circling around something deeper, as if they already knew and were waiting for him to slip. But Evan did not. He kept his voice steady, his body still even when his mind was a storm beneath his skin. After an hour, they finally moved toward the door, one of them pausing to look back and say softly that abandoned property had been reported in nearby zones, that if he saw anything or anyone, he should report it at once. Evan nodded and said, of course, knowing full well that his silence was now a louder voice than any scream when they left, and the door closed behind them. Evan did not move for a long time. He stood there, listening to the wind outside the silence. Inside, and the beat of his heart pounding louder than both, he opened the panel and helped Lena out, her hands cold, her face pale, her eyes blinking fast, not from fear, but from holding back tears, not for herself, but for him, for the risk he took. The price he might still pay. She asked if they would return, and he said yes, maybe not soon, but someday they would, and next time they would not come alone. She asked what they would do if they found her, and he did not answer because both of them already knew. That night, Evan sat near the COM panel staring at an old encrypted channel, a line he had not used in years back when the world still had sparks of resistance scattered through the void, people who helped others without asking who, risked everything for strangers who still believed in freedom more than survival. He opened the channel, sent a short message, only coordinates, only one word, urgent, and then he waited, not knowing if anyone would hear, not knowing if anyone would care. Lena sat beside him, her fingers brushing his lightly, her voice soft when she said that she did not want him to suffer for her, that she would leave if it kept him safe. But he shook his head, looked at her, and said that safety without honor was not life, that silence in the face of injustice was the same as cruelty, and that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The shelter held quiet again, the fire steady, the walls strong. But outside in the frozen dark, something was changing, something moving, not just in the sky or the snow, but in the hearts of two people who had found something worth protecting in a world that had long forgotten what that meant. The next morning arrived, slow and silent, with sky still heavy and the mountains wrapped in endless snow. The wind carried no sound, only the steady breath of a world too cold to care. And inside the small shelter, Evan stood at the edge of the map screen, staring at the blinking dot that had appeared during the early hours, a response from the old channel. A ship was coming. It would land at a location 15 kilometers to the west, just beyond the frozen ridge, where sensors could not reach, where signals bent around the cliffs like whispers in the dark. They had 6 hours before arrival, and Evan knew what had to be done. He turned toward Lena, who stood wrapped in thermal gear, still silent, but watching him with eyes that no longer held fear, only quiet strength. She did not ask questions, she only nodded as he explained the path, the risks, the time it would take, and the danger of what waited behind. If they stayed, because the patrols would return soon, and next time they would not leave empty-handed. She helped him pack rations, emergency flares, extra heat packs, a signal beacon wrapped tight and hidden from scans, everything they needed to survive the walk in the frozen world outside. Evan left a note on the table, not for anyone but for himself. A quiet message saying he had chosen what felt right, not what felt easy. And when they stepped out into the snow, the sky seemed to hold its breath, the wind paused as if surprised, and the cold greeted them with sharp teeth and open arms. But they moved forward step by step, slow but steady, across the white silence that stretched like a sea without end. Lena walked beside him, never falling behind her movements. Careful, her steps light, but sure. She had never walked this path, never seen this ridge, never faced this wind, but something inside her carried her forward with the strength of someone who had already survived the worst kind of storm. They climbed narrow slopes, crossed frozen rivers, moved beneath rock arches that looked like the bones of old giants, and still the dot on the screen grew closer, the beacon flashing, slowly counting down the time until the ship would land. They spoke little, only when needed, saving breath for the walk, saving energy for what might come ahead. And in that silence they shared more than words could carry, a bond not made of blood or promise, but of moments chosen freely when nothing had been certain, except the decision to not let each other fall. At one point the snow deepened and Lena stumbled, falling forward, her hands sinking into the cold, and Evan reached for her without pause, pulling her up, steadying her. And she looked at him not with shame, but with something close to wonder, because every time she had fallen before, the world had stepped over her, and now for the first time someone reached without hesitation, not to lift property, not to fix damage, but simply because she mattered. As they neared the landing point, the wind shifted, growing louder, more aggressive, as if trying to block their path. The last hill was steep, covered in loose frost and hidden ice, but they climbed it together, Evan going first, making space, Lena following close, using his footsteps as guide. And when they reached the top, they saw the flat open space below where the ship would land, the sky already breaking with a low rumble as something moved above the clouds. They waited near the edge, hidden by a large stone outcrop, and watched as the ship came down, slow and smooth, painted dark with no lights visible, only the soft sound of landing gear touching snow and the quiet hum of an engine built for stealth. Evan activated the beacon and held it high once, then twice, then a third time, the universal signal for friendly contact, and the ship responded with a soft pulse from its side door, sliding open with a hiss that seemed to melt the air. A figure stepped out, bundled in heavy coat, face covered but posture calm and strong, and Evan stepped forward slowly, hand raised, not in surrender, but in greeting, and the figure nodded once, then looked toward Lena and gave the same nod again, not asking questions, not offering judgment, only the kind of silent respect that is born from knowing the weight of what others carry. Lena looked at Evan, her eyes wide, her breath caught between fear and hope, and he smiled, the first real smile in days, and told her this was her chance, her real chance, not to hide, not to run, but to start again, without chains, without fear, without needing to ask if she was allowed to breathe. She stepped toward the ship, slowly pausing at the door, turning back to look at him one last time, her hand lifted, not in goodbye, but in promise, a silent vow that she would carry this moment with her always. And he nodded once, his chest tight, but his heart warm, knowing she would live, not because someone allowed it, but because she chose it, and that choice could never be taken again. Ship rose moments later, disappearing into the clouds, leaving only wind and snow behind, and Evan stood there alone for a while, his body still, his face calm, his thoughts running in quiet circles through memory and feeling. He turned back toward the ridge, his legs aching, his breath sharp, but his step sure, because now the shelter no longer felt like a cage, but like a place where something had begun, and even if the world came knocking again, he would open the door without fear, because he had already made his choice, and nothing could take it from him. He walked back through the snow, leaving footprints that the wind would erase, but not forget, and somewhere in the sky above, freedom moved through space, carrying a soul once left to die, now burning bright with life and the fire that had begun. Between them would not go out, it would grow in silence and strength, in every choice made from that day on, and even if no one ever knew the story, he would remember it, not as rescue or sacrifice, but as a moment when two strangers changed each other. Not with power or words, but with the quiet, simple courage to care. The end.